session, and I'm deeply honored to be like your moderator in these sessions. And we come together to explore the topic, the story of tyrants, resilience from the Qur'an. But before we jump to the topic, I would introduce our speakers today. His name is Ustad Yusuf, or Brother Yusuf Shah Masud, who will guide us through this important topic. So our brother Yusuf is a proud member of Phoenix Muslim community, having grown up in Chandler in Arizona. He currently serves as the Director of Development of both ACA, the only K-12 Islamic school in Arizona, and Greater Arizona, the largest scholarship provider for Muslim students in the United States. In addition to his development and scholarly work, he is active with MOVE, MAS, and many other local organizations and masajid. He is also the first graduate of Zaytuna College from Arizona, the Muslim liberal arts college in United States. So to ensure the sessions run smoothly, I kindly ask for everyone here to remain attentive throughout the materials will be sent, and feel free to take notes and prepare questions if you have for the Q&A in the last segment of the sessions. So for Brother Yusuf, without further ado, we will send this kind of time to yours, and take your time. Thank you. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair. I was thinking that maybe you would introduce me in Bahasa, and I was like, I won't have any idea what he says. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين والعاقبة للمتقين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, the infinitely compassionate, the intimately loving, I bear witness to the oneness of Allah, to His magnificence, His omnipotence, His might, His glory, to His being the creator and sustainer of all things, the giver of life, guider of hearts, master of the day of judgment. And I bear witness that Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa azwajihi wa sallam is His final prophet, apostle, and messenger. May the peace and blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be upon him, upon his family, upon his companions, and upon all those who choose to tread and follow in his path until the last day. May we be counted amongst them. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First and foremost, I don't know if you've had any speakers from Phoenix. If you haven't, I wanted to say, as a member of the Phoenix Muslim community, welcome to Phoenix. Ahlan wa sahlan. Thank you for choosing this wonderful city to have your incredible convention and conference, and I hope this is the first of many times that you do so. And thank you for having outsiders like us participate and be part of it. It's such a wonderful time of year to come as well. I would not recommend that you come in the summer, inshallah. I was thinking to myself, subhanAllah, this conference has been organized so well, and if the ummah could be as organized and united as the people who've organized this conference and the Muslims of Southeast Asia, of Malaysia, of Indonesia, then we would be in a much better place as an ummah. I was blessed to do Umrah a few months ago, and when I was there, I was just amazed, and as we always are when we're there, to see the Indonesian and Malaysian contingents and how organized they are. So we have a lot more to benefit from you than you have to us, and we just ask that you share this beautiful culture of yours so that we can benefit as an ummah as well. And I wanted to say on a personal note that I have a deep love for Indonesia and the people of Indonesia. And one of the reasons for that is because my spiritual mentor and someone that I look up to and I admire and I have spent so many years of my life studying, Imam Malcolm X, who should not be a stranger to anyone in this room. How many of you have heard of Malcolm X? How many of you knew that Malcolm X, one of the formative experiences of his life was to actually visit Indonesia? He attended the Bandung conference that happened in Bandung, Indonesia in 1954, 1955. And it shaped so much of his political thought that later in his career, he constantly, if you look at some of his last speeches that he gave, he would mention the Bandung conference of the non-aligned movement that happened in Indonesia. So he had a deep love for Indonesia and for the Indonesian people, and I carry that as well. So it's really beautiful to be here. And it's a unique thing in the ummah that, usually these kinds of events are fixed, and the people who attend them are one type of people, but that in an ummah, someone like myself could participate and feel at home and feel amongst brothers and sisters. So thank you all for coming, and I really appreciate that. The topic that I was given was an interesting one. It was stories of tyrants, resilience in the Qur'an. Stories of tyrants, resilience in the Qur'an, or resilience from the Qur'an. And one of the things I thought about this topic is that, subhanAllah, the stories of the tyrants are not that interesting. The stories of the tyrants, I don't even want to spend time talking about the stories of tyrants because they're not interesting. The tyrants are all the same. They have the same story. They have the same characteristics. They have the same attitude. The stories of the tyrants are not interesting. So instead of talking about the stories of the tyrants, I want to speak about the stories of the people who resist the tyrants, who confront the tyrants, who face the tyrants. That's where we find resilience in the Qur'an. That's where we'll find something. And I also want us to recognize and acknowledge that to find stories of the people that confront tyranny and oppression, we don't actually have to go that far. We don't have to go that far back in history as well. We don't even have to go to the Qur'an to see this. Of course, we look at the Qur'an for inspiration and understand these stories, but if we look at the world today, we don't have to go far to find people who confront tyranny. And we don't have to go far to find people in this ummah who show us the meaning of what it means to be resilient. So I want to start with one of these stories, not from the Qur'an, but someone who is shaped and molded by the Qur'an. Aisha radiallahu anha, she said about our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Kana khuluquhu Qur'an," that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was, he embodied the Qur'an. He was a living Qur'an. He was a walking Qur'an. And therefore, the people who follow the walking Qur'an, follow the sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ, themselves are shaped and molded by the Qur'an. And one of these people that I want to acknowledge and commemorate and remember today was taken from this world 2 weeks ago. And it is a wonderful elderly man whose name was Khalid Nabhan. Many of you may be familiar with him, and if you're not, I want to share a few things about him. This genocide that began 446 days ago, this genocide that's on all of our minds has had a lot of casualties. A lot of people have died as a result of it. We've lost a lot of people. And just 2 weeks ago, this pious and righteous man of Allah was taken from us. This man captivated our attention for over a year. For over a year, at the beginning of this genocide, in the first month of this terrible tragedy that has befallen this ummah, this man Khalid, he lost the two things that he loved more than anything else. One of them was his grandson, and the other was his granddaughter. He had 2 grandchildren, Tariq and Reem. And at the first month of this genocide, he lost both of them. And the way that many of us first came to learn about this man, Khalid Nabhan, was a heartbreaking video of him holding his lifeless granddaughter who had been killed in an airstrike. And he's holding her and kissing her, and you can see the grief. He's not expressing it, but you can see the grief. He's kissing her, he's kissing her nose, her eyes. And he says, Ruh al-Ruh, the soul of my soul. He's calling her the soul of my soul. And we watch these videos and it breaks our hearts. And what's remarkable about this man is that he is the definition, he is the image that everyone has of an Arab, of a Palestinian, of a Muslim. He has a beard, he has a turban, but just watching this video, you can see the amount of compassion and love this man has. And so we learn about this man, and for a year we watch videos. So many videos about him came out. One video, he's calling all the cats in the nearby area, and as these cats are coming towards him, he starts feeding these kittens. Beautiful scene. these children who are malnourished and are living through famine, man-made famine, he is scooping food for them and distributing food for them. We see this beautiful video of him carrying a flower and surprising his elderly mother. We saw so many of these videos. I saw a video of Sheikh Yasir Qadi, very well-known scholar here in America, and he's speaking to Sheikh Khalid, and at some point he has no words. You know, Sheikh Yasir Qadi is someone who's so eloquent, speaks so beautifully, and he says to Sheikh Khalid, I don't have any words, I don't know what to say. And then, you know, he was able to speak at one of these previous conventions that happened earlier this year. Sheikh Khalid was someone who gave us the definition, the meaning of resilience, what it means to be resilient. We saw this video of him consoling a mother who lost her children in an airstrike. And he's comforting her, and he's saying, I also lost the soul of my soul. I lost my grandchildren as well. But he, despite that, is comforting her and trying to make things easier on her. He was someone who's walking the Qur'an and living the Sunnah. And he showed all of us what it means to be Muslim, what it means to be a Muslim man in this time, and what it means to be resilient, what it means to remain strong. And so we don't have to even go to the Qur'an. We can see living examples of the Qur'an today that exemplify this, that show us what it means. And one of our teachers was saying that, you know, if you think about it, Khalid, for a year, Uncle Khalid, he had to live with the pain and the grief of being separated from his granddaughter. Because after his granddaughter, horrible girl's face. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in His wisdom, decided that it was time to reunite them together. And Uncle Khalid would go back to be with his granddaughter. And that's what Allah does. Allah wants the people that He loves to be back with Him. And so it's actually a mercy. And subhanAllah, before Uncle Khalid passed away, we were told that he was actually rushing to save some people who were injured at an airstrike. And so he lived as a shaheed, he lived as an embodiment of resilience, and he died as a shaheed as well. And these people, the shuhada, are alive with their Lord. Uncle Khalid, Reem, Tariq, and all of these innocent people are alive with Allah. They are not dead. And we have to make sure that they remain alive in our hearts as well, that we don't forget about them, that we remember them. They're not just a statistic. They're not just a number, 40,000, 50,000, 200,000. These are living, breathing human beings that show us what it means to be Muslim and what it means to be resilient. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Qur'an that He created human beings in struggle. The story of the human being is struggle. لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي كَبَدٍ. Right? Certainly, we have created man to be in hardship and in struggle. I came across this story, and it's probably not a real conversation, but I think there's some wisdom in it, where a person speaks to Allah, speaks to God, and is asking God for some things. And the conversation is interesting. So the person is speaking about what they wish to become, what they want to be. And so they say, I want to be courageous. They tell Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I want to be courageous. I want to be brave. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to them in this fictional conversation, I will give you demons and monsters to terrify you. You want to be brave? I will send demons your way. I will send monsters your way. That way you can learn to conquer them. And so the person realizes, no, I don't want to be courageous. I don't want to have to face these monsters. And so they say, oh Allah, I want to be patient. I want to be someone of patience. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, then I will make you work hard and long. And I won't allow you to see the fruits of the work that you do until much, much later. So you learn what it means to be patient, and you learn to wait. And the person says, no, I don't want to have to deal with that. That's too hard. I have to do all this work and I don't see any results. And so they say, I want to be wise. Ya Allah, I want to be wise. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would reply to them and they say, I will give you failure. You will fail miserably in your life and it will crush your spirit. Then you can learn the value of judgment and of wisdom, and that wisdom comes at a cost. And so the person says, this all sounds like a very hard life. This sounds like a very hard life. Can you give me a good life? I don't want a hard life, I want a good life. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this story replies, just like we measure the quality of a blacksmith, how good someone who makes swords is based on how strong the steel is, how strong the sword is. It's based on the strength of the steel, not the fire and the hammer that made it, but the end product. That's what it takes to make someone. A good life isn't an easy life. A good life makes you resilient. It makes you strong. You deal with hardship and struggle. And that is a hard life. And I think this is a beautiful story because it shows us that in life, these tests from life, these challenges, these struggles are what allow us to be resilient and to be strong. One of the things that we have to recognize as Muslims is that the Qur'an is relevant to the moment that we are in. The Qur'an is relevant, it speaks to us and speaks to the time that we are living through. Because the Qur'an is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He speaks to us. He speaks to us. He speaks to us, He is engaged in our affairs. Kullu yawmin huwa fi sha'n. At every moment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is engaged in our affairs. We don't believe in a deity, in a God who created the universe, set it in motion and left it. We don't believe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just above His creation. He is interacting with His creation. We can have a personal relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Qur'an is a way for us to do that. Just like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is eternal, His speech is eternal. It has eternal significance. The Qur'an speaks to the state of the world that we live in today at this moment in December of 2024, just as it did 15 centuries ago and will for the rest of time. And the Qur'an is filled with stories of resilience, of resistance, showing us individuals and communities who, despite incredible trials, despite incredible challenges, they were able to persevere. And one of the things that we learn is that the believers have two wings. One of the wings of the believer that allows us to go far. I was speaking to the middle schoolers and I told them a famous African proverb. They say, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. Go together. And that shows us the importance of community. But one of the things that allow us to go fast and far is the wings. If the believer is missing one of these wings, they won't be able to make it. One of those wings is shukr, gratitude, being pleased with Allah, being grateful and content with what Allah has given us. But the other wing of the believer is sabr. And I want to focus on this for the rest of my time with you. Because we think of patience as a passive act, that you just sit there and you be patient. But if you think about it, patience is actually a lot of action. It's not easy to be patient. You know, seeing Uncle Khalid, what was beautiful about him is you could see how hard it was for him to, not be affected, to be so patient with all the challenges that he's been given. You can see the difficulty for our Palestinian brothers and sisters. But we find that perseverance, resilience, patience, it takes incredible strength. And that's what makes it so beautiful. Uncle Khalid wasn't someone who began this conflict. He wasn't party on either side for how things played out. He was just a bystander. But you could see the strength that he had. And so I want to share an interesting concept by an author named Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Maybe about 10, 15 years ago, he came up with this really interesting idea. Because when we think of this word resilience and this idea of resilience, to be strong, to be able to take a beating, you think of the opposite. What's the opposite of resilience? And you think it's fragility. The opposite of something being resilient is to be fragile. Like these beautiful centerpieces with the flowers, right, on the tables. If I take that and I drop it, what's going to happen? It's going to shatter. That's something that's fragile. So we think of resilience as the opposite of that. Something that's resilient means that it can take a hit, it can take a beating, it will still stay strong. But there's actually another level to that. That's something that's even beyond being resilient. Because over time, you take something, even if it's strong, you could break it down. But there's another category which this author calls anti-fragile. Something that's not just resilient, that's not fragile, but it's anti-fragile. Meaning something that takes a hit, takes a beating, and as a result of it, becomes stronger, becomes more resilient, becomes less affected by things. I want to share a unique experiment that happened. It actually happened here in Arizona, maybe 10, 15 years ago. It was called Biosphere 2. So there's this city in Arizona, and humans have this interesting idea that they want to go colonize other planets. It's not enough that we've colonized so much of the world, we've exploited so much of the world, we're making it unlivable. This idea that some people have, now we're going to go to other planets. Elon Musk wants to go to Mars, and we're going to colonize Mars. And so to start that process, the scientists realized we need to figure out how to make life possible in these inhospitable environments. And so there's this project called Biosphere 2, where they created a vacuum, a place without any of these environmental conditions, and they're all artificially made. And one of the things they were trying to do is to grow trees. You can't live without crops and food. So they're trying to grow some trees. And they created this artificial environment. Everything is synthetic, artificial, it's not natural. It's all man-made. And they were able to take some seeds and grow trees in this environment. And the trees grow very quickly. They figured out exactly how much nitrogen they need, what the soil conditions need to be like, all this, right? And they started to make some trees. And so the trees grew very quickly. But what's interesting is the trees grew, but then any time the trees were pushed or hit or anything happened, they would immediately crack. These trees grew very quickly, but they were not resilient. They broke very easily. And the scientists realized the reason why. Because in the real world, trees have to deal with wind. But in this artificial world that they created, there was no wind. And because of that, the tree is met with wind and resistance. It learns to grow its root system. Its trunk becomes stronger. But these trees that never dealt with any wind, the first time they hit some wind or something pushed it, it immediately broke. This is a lesson of something that is anti-fragile. That wind actually helps the tree become stronger, the root system become stronger. That this is the reality of life, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests us. And the point of these tests and these challenges is to make people strong, resilient, and strong in their relationship with Allah. If the trees meet no resistance, they won't be strong. They won't be beautiful. They'll die very quickly. And the same thing goes for people. And that's why one of the things we find is that the people who were tested the most were the prophets of Allah. The prophets of Allah. And if you look at the Qur'an, you'll find the resilience of the prophets and of the Salihin and the righteous people who came before us, right? So I want to spend some time mentioning a couple of the stories from the Qur'an. We all know these stories, but I want to make us realize that these stories, every single one of them, each of these prophets and righteous people that I'll mention, they had different lives, they had different experiences, they had different challenges. But there was one thing they all had in common, which was their resilience. The first one I want to mention is Nuh alayhi salam. Nuh alayhi salam. We all know his story. And he is an exemplar of resilience in preaching the message. And we all know that for 950 years, for almost 10 centuries, a millennia, 1,000 years, he preached to his people. He called his people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to worship him. And what did they do? They mocked him, they neglected him, they rejected him. He said, "My Lord, I invite the people day and night to the truth, but my invitation actually makes them run away more." Our brothers and sisters in Gaza or in Kashmir and so many other places, they've dealt with hardship for 7 decades. 70 years, 70 or more years, right? Multiple generation. And we may feel like this is a long time. We're trying to convince people that this is an occupation. This is a genocide. This is apartheid. We're trying to tell them that they're being ethnically cleansed. Nobody's listening. We have to remember the story of Nuh alayhi salam. 950 years he preached to his people. They didn't listen. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his ministry, his da'wah was 23 years. For those first 13 years, how many people embraced Islam? Less than 200 people. For 13 years, he worked so hard, less than 200 people became Muslim. It was only the last few years of his life that people embraced Islam in droves. Tens, hundreds of thousands of people embraced Islam, right? Islam did not spread overnight. It didn't happen overnight. In Egypt, if you study Islamic history, Islam was in Egypt from the time of Amr ibn al-As, the Sahaba. It took 300 years for them to become majority Muslim, meaning 51%. And it took hundreds of years longer to become 80, 90% Muslim as it is today. Even if you study the history of Indonesia, I taught world history for a few years to my students, and I teach them about how Islam spread in Indonesia. It's a beautiful way that it happened. Islam didn't come really to Indonesia until the 13th century, the 1200s. And it took hundreds of years. You had these incredible awliya of Allah, the Wali Songo, and I apologize, you know better than I do this history. And it took hundreds of years, but now, subhanAllah, Islam in Indonesia is strong. There's more Muslims in Indonesia than any other part of the world. Like, what a beautiful story. These things happen, they take time. And Nuh alayhi salam's story shows us resilience in putting up with abuse, putting up with continuing preaching and the dawah and all of this. And we have to recognize that our efforts here in America are also not meaningless. It could be the case that the history of Islam is the greatest thing that happens in America. We don't know that. We won't see that in our lifetimes. But it could be our great-great-grandchildren look back at history and realize Islam was a really great thing that happened in this country. And perhaps many, many people are Muslim here. So we must be resilient in doing the work of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in doing the da'wah and spreading this message. Another thing I want to mention, because alhamdulillah we have a lot of youth here, and sometimes we get very hopeless. We see the influences, we see the effect that the device is happening, we see their mental health. And I just want to mention that Nuh alayhi salam, he tried to convince his own son, those hundreds of years, even his own son, he tried to get the message across. And unfortunately in this situation, it didn't work out. Even the prophets had a hard time with their children. But our children are not like the son of Nuh alayhi salam. And so we should continue, we shouldn't give up. Sometimes we give up with our children an hour, a week, a month, and we're like, you're a lost cause. No, we continue. And inshallah, they will come back and they will learn their lesson and they will return. Another prophet I want to mention is the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And here is an example of resilience against tyranny, right? This topic of tyranny. Because Ibrahim alayhi salam is someone who his entire life, he did not have a large following. He did not have a large ummah. Very few people followed him. And he went from place to place. He was kicked out, he was exiled. And one of the greatest tyrants of that time, the king of Babylon, wanted to throw him into a fire. We all know this story. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Bardan wa salama, fire, be cool. And that fire did not burn him. It was actually cool for him. It was peaceful. He experienced peace like nothing else. And before that, he said, Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel. Now, what I want to mention about this, because the topic is the story of the tyrants. And I said that story of the tyrant is not even worth speaking about. What's interesting about the Qur'an is very few tyrants are actually mentioned. We know Fir'aun, we know Qarun, we know a few others. But in this case, everyone knows that this is Nimrod, right? The person, the king who throws Ibrahim alayhi salam into the fire is Nimrod. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't even bother to give us his name. One of the stories that I want to end with today is the Ashabul Ukhdud, the people who are thrown into a trench. The king who did that, we don't even know his name. Allah doesn't even bother to tell us his name. It shows us how insignificant these tyrants are. If you look at the way Namrud died, he died because of a mosquito. A mosquito bite killed him. This person thought he was on top of the world. He was this powerful king, and yet a mosquito killed him. It just shows how pathetic and weak these tyrants are. Their name doesn't matter. Their existence doesn't matter. Their life doesn't matter. They are in the dustbin of history. But who do we remember? We remember Ibrahim alayhi salam, who had a very small ummah, but his progeny, all of the Muslims that came after him, all of the prophets that came after him are from his line. That's who we remember. Prophet Musa alayhi salam, in his struggle with Bani Israel, he witnessed the ethnic cleansing of his own people, genocide against the young boys of his people. And he grew up in the house of Fir'aun, and he was kicked out. He had to run away as a refugee. He was in exile. He came back. He spoke out against Fir'aun. He went through all of this struggle. He was someone who showed us what it means to be resilient. And then, subhanAllah, once Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opens up the ocean for Bani Israel, the sea, and they escape, right? Musa is able to lead them. This is probably one of the most incredible miracles in history, one of the great moments in world history, where the sea literally opens up for Bani Israel. And yet afterwards, they go to the desert and they don't listen to Musa alayhi salam. They disobey him, Bani Israel. And as a result of that, they are left wandering the desert for 40 years. And what's powerful about this story is to show us that sometimes the tyrant is not out there. Fir'aun was a tyrant. They overcame that tyrant, but they still had a tyrant inside themselves. Sometimes we are our own worst tyrants. Sometimes our nafs is the worst tyrant. And so that's an important lesson as well for us to realize in the story of Musa alayhi salam, in the story of Bani Israel, that the tyrant might be beyond us. It might not be beyond us. It might be within ourselves. The story of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, the resilience in adversity. Yusuf alayhi salam, can you think of someone more noble in lineage? Yusuf alayhi salam, the son of a prophet. Who was the son of a prophet? Who was the son of a prophet? Yusuf alayhi salam's father was a prophet. His grandfather was a prophet. His great-grandfather was a prophet. Great prophets, Ibrahim alayhi salam, Ishaq alayhi salam, Yaqub alayhi salam. Yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still tested him. He was still thrown into the well by his own brothers. He was still sold into captivity. He still had to serve as a servant, a slave in the house of the Aziz. He had to still endure prison. And I think about those moments that he had alone, so much of his life. Imagine sitting in a dark well by yourself, not knowing if anyone's going to find you. And then when you're found, you're immediately taken in chains, away from your family, and then having to live through prison. One of the poets of my formative years, this beautiful nasheed artist named Dawood Warnsby, he has these beautiful lines where he says, in the minutes and months and years that drift by, graying away his youth, he spent his hours in quiet worship in the silent jihad for the truth. That Yusuf alayhi salam, he goes into prison as still a young man. His hair is still gray, and yet he's spending his time rotting away in a prison cell, graying away his youth. His hair is becoming gray. But he spends his hours in quiet worship, worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, being with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the silent jihad for the truth. That's what he does for all that time. We saw a few weeks ago these prisoners come out of these infamous prisons of Syria. They used to say that if you want to interrogate someone, send them to Jordan. If you want to torture someone, you send them to Syria, the Syrian prisons. And if you want them to disappear, you send them to Egyptian prisons. These prisons, these dungeons, we see people coming out after 10, 15, 40 years in some cases. And we see how traumatized they are, how much they endured. But you see others who are resilient. And Yusuf alayhi salam was one of these people. It's so powerful. And subhanAllah, I'll share this on a personal note. A few months ago, I was at one of these encampments. These protests that were happening on college campuses, protesting against the universities and their support for this apartheid regime. And I was actually arrested. And I spent 24 hours in this system. And 24 hours is nothing compared to the time that was faced by Yusuf alayhi salam, the time that was faced by my own grandfather, the time that was faced by so many people who came before us, the time that these people in Syria and in Bangladesh faced. But I'm telling you that 24 hours it was difficult. It wasn't a comfortable experience. It wasn't easy. And at the same time, one thing that I want to share with you is me there. I was one Muslim, and there were just a handful of Muslims. Most of them were non-Muslims. Many of them were 19, 20 years old. They had such a hard time. They're still traumatized. But alhamdulillah, I remembered the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. I remember the story of all these pious people before us, and it gave me strength. Reading the Qur'an, knowing the stories of the Qur'an gave me strength. This teaches us resilience. When we know that there are people like Uncle Khalid in the world that are dealing with what they're dealing with, we realize that our problems are nothing. And it teaches us to be resilient. And I don't want to make it seem like these stories that I'm mentioning are of prophets and of men, but the resilience can be found in women as well. And one of the most beautiful stories of that is Maryam alayhi salam. Maryam alayhi salam, and the wife of Fir'aun, Asya alayhi salam. But Maryam alayhi salam, she was pregnant with a child in a society where if you're not married, there's so much judgment. but she was patient. And despite the hardship, she carried this child and brought this child back to society. She was resilient despite the social isolation and despite the judgment. And subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it easy on her and gave a miracle where Isa alayhi salam actually started to speak and defend his own mother. This infant started to defend a mother. And the last story that I'll mention, I could mention many, many more stories. The story of Yunus alayhi salam, the story of Ayyub alayhi salam, the story of Lut alayhi salam, many, many stories that we can mention. But the last one I want to mention is the story of Ashabul Ukhdud, because I think this is a relevant story for today. A few months ago, we saw a terrible scene of a young man named Sha'ban. He's what every one of us would want for our children. This young man who is a university student, who's living through a genocide, who's trying to provide for his family. He still continues his study, studying in a tent, taking classes and all of that. We have students here in this country who barely show up to class. He's sitting in a tent and he's still trying to get his degree so he could provide for his family. But this boy, he was born in Gaza and he wasn't able to evacuate his family. And so one night he is sleeping inside the masjid. He's a hafidh of Qur'an and he goes to the masjid for some rest. And there's an airstrike at the masjid. And so he becomes injured. And so then he is transferred to a hospital. And actually there's no space in the hospital, so he's actually in the courtyard of the hospital. He's recovering from his injuries, and another airstrike happens. And this airstrike begins a fire. And we saw this horrifying scene of this illegal, unethical, immoral apartheid state and their army burn people alive. This scene that scars us, it's just impossible to deal with. We saw this. And when we read the Qur'an, we realize this is nothing new. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually gives us an example of a people who had genocide committed against them. And these were the people of the trench. And subhanAllah, this is a very interesting way to name a group of people. The people of the trench. Because what's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doing? He's naming the people based on how they passed away, how they died. Right? He's not naming them. I mean, they could have been anything. They could have been barbers, they could have been dentists, they could have been blacksmiths, they could have been candlestick makers. Usually people identify themselves based on what they do or where they live. I'm from Phoenix. I'm from the US. I'm from Malaysia, Indonesia. I'm from Africa. Sometimes they identify themselves based on all kinds of things. They don't identify themselves based on how they died, but that's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is identifying them. And we don't recognize this because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually honoring them. He's saying these are people, they died because they were burned alive in a trench. And why were they burned alive? These people were burned alive because they refused to disobey me. They refused to disown me. They insisted on belief in me. And they were punished as a result of it. These people were willing to make this sacrifice for my sake. And so I'm honoring them by calling themselves people of the trench. They could have been university students. They could have been, whatever occupation they had. But the moment they fell into that trench, they stopped being that. Instead, they were shuhada. They were people that would be alive with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is honoring them by calling them Ashabul Ukhdud, the people who are burned in the trench. And again, you see this pattern here. The person who did this to them, this king, history books mention his name is Dhun Nuwas. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't mention his name. His name is not important. He's not important. And actually, we don't even know what happens to him. There are some tyrants that we know what happens to them. Fir'aun, we know what happened to him. Namrud, we know what happened to him. This king, he could have gotten away with it. He could have lived out his life, in his throne, in his palace. But what's important for us to recognize is that this king was a king who, despite getting away with it, nobody will get away with it at the end of the day. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Buruj, when He mentions this surah, the ayah comes, وَشَاهِدٍ وَمَشْهُودٍ. The witness and the people who witness. The witness. Who's the witness? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what was witnessed? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying I witnessed everything. I witnessed this king and what he did. I witnessed, and he mentions the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The promise of Allah is that these people will sit under rivers in which, gardens beneath which rivers flow, right? Their promise is Jannah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, Inna batshaka rabbika la shadid, that the punishment of Allah is severe. That's the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this surah, in the context of a genocide, in the context of brothers and sisters burning to death under airstrikes, it should make us realize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is nothing new. That believers in the past had gone through, in some cases, much worse. And so they remained resilient. They remained faithful till the end. And we have to recognize that we have to be the same. That, these stories teach us what it means to be resilient, to be strong, to have faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these tests are actually a good thing for us. They make us stronger. Why? Because we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised that He will not burden a soul beyond what they can bear. Nobody's going to have to deal with more than we can bear. So our responsibility is to recognize that Allah will burden us. And we want a burden just to the extent that we can't handle it anymore. And that's the way for us to strengthen our legs. My teacher, Imam Zaid, used to tell us when we were students, it's time to stop lowering the bar, right? You have sports games, Olympics, that kind of thing. They jump over the bar. He said it's time for us to stop lowering the bar. We have to strengthen our legs. So we as a community, as an ummah, we have to strengthen our legs. We have to learn to be resilient and to be strong. And inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will allow us to navigate these waters, these difficult times. He'll give us the ability to swim and make it to our destination and where we'd like to go. These are some stories from the Qur'an of people, not of the stories of the tyrants. I'm not interested in those stories. I'm interested in the people who confronted tyranny, who confronted oppression, who confronted persecution, and how they made it through. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He doesn't allow us to have to deal with that ourselves, but that He gives us the strength to advocate for those people who are going through it. May we be people who are able to advocate for our brothers and sisters all over the world. Wa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.
Thank you. MashaAllah, thank you so much. For all of you guys, we can give applause to Sheikh Yusuf for all the stories, all the appreciation that you can get it. Thank you. So guys, when we heard about our stories about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and everything that comes from the previous prophets like Yusuf alayhi salam, Maryam, and even the last one is Ashabul Ukhdud. The stories are really, really interesting. And all the stories comes from how we power our strength in believing in Qur'an. And whenever we came back, and people who live in Gaza, when they got genocide, but they believe in Allah, even they got hardship and everything that they has given with Israel and everything that comes to them, but they being patient and everything that they always give, but Allah is just only enough for them. So next question, next step, we still have 5 minutes. If you all guys have some questions, you can ask Brother Yusuf. Maybe that could be really curious, how to overcome the problem in Palestine, and every problem that you have that are related to this kind of topic. I'll give you 1 or 2 questions. Okay, we have one, brothers, and okay. We still have, okay, 3 questions is enough. And we have one from Fadli, and one behind, the back of, the women, and okay, thank you.
Yeah, Assalamualaikum, Sheikh. It's going to be short. So you mentioned that your experience when you go to the prison, is that the most stressful experience you have? And then could you describe or tell us more detail how is really you facing it basically? You said that because you know the story from the Quran. Is that only thing, or because you know that you stand up for your values, maybe, or because you know that Allah will. I don't know, but please tell us more in detail. Thank you. Jazakallah.
Thank you for the question. I'll quickly answer it, inshallah. I think, subhanAllah, there's so many people who've been incarcerated, who've been imprisoned unjustly. The Qur'an gives us the perfect story of this Yusuf alayhi salam, and there are so many people afterwards that I could mention or name. And one of the stories I'll mention is Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah, very well-known scholar in the past. He said one time, what can they do to me? What can they do to me? If they imprison me, then I will worship Allah. If they exile me, if they send me away from my land, then I will wander the earth and look at Allah's creation. And if they kill me, I'll be shaheed. So when you have people like this, that you remember these things, it makes it, what can they do to me? What's the worst they can do, right? It allows you to be strong and deal with these things. So was going to jail for a day the worst experience that I've had? It was both the worst and the best experience I've had. Because I'll say, subhanAllah, I prayed Fajr for the first time with my hands cuffed behind my back. And that was a profound experience. It made me grow closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are many, many other things I could share personal that I'm grateful that Allah allowed me to give that experience. And also for me to know that this is the least I can do for my brothers and sisters and what they're enduring. So that gives me strength. And these other youth, they were very brave, but I can see how hard they had it because they didn't have the Qur'an the way that I do. And so I ask that all of us have that relationship with Allah and that relationship with the Qur'an, that whatever challenges come, it actually makes us grow closer to Him.
Thank you so much for the answer and the experience that you have shared to us. Okay, for next questions, yeah.
Assalamualaikum.
Okay.
My name is Nurul. My question is, as parents, we would like to provide for our children as much as possible, to make them live comfortably. But as you said, in the biosphere experience, because when there is no wind, then the trees basically will just shatter. How do we find the fine balance between providing for our children, making sure they're safe and secure, but also to make sure that they have the resilience to be Muslim, especially in this day and age? Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is a really, really beautiful and important question that I've been thinking a lot about recently. There's a book I'd recommend for every single parent in this room to read, every single teacher to read. It came out a few months ago. It's called The Anxious Generation. The Anxious Generation. It's by an author named Jonathan Haidt. He's a very well-known academic. And this book is about what has happened to our children. We see higher rates of mental health issues, a lot of anxiety. And he mentions many, many things. But two things that I'll mention is that our children, and I include myself in this, I grew up in this generation as well. We grew up in a time, if we ask our parents the freedom they had, my father growing up in a village in Bangladesh, how much freedom they had. They could go out, they're swimming in the river, they're playing. Even in this country, kids would go out and play with their friends. They just have to be back before dinner time, before Maghrib time, basically. They had so much freedom. And I'm assuming back home in Indonesia, Malaysia, it was similar, where kids would go out. What happened in the past few decades is we started sheltering our kids a lot. We started keeping them home. We said, oh no, there's this threat, that threat, kidnappers, and so on and so forth. And some of these are legitimate. And at the same time, this new thing came into our lives, the internet, and our phones and our devices. And the kids, they couldn't go outside and they started spending time there. And while we started protecting them from the outside world, we didn't do enough to protect them from these devices and the internet. And so this kind of inversed things, and it actually made the situation a lot worse. And so there's this movement that a lot of people follow. It's called free-range parenting, where the idea is that we will do more to restrict and regulate and protect our children from the internet, from their devices. If we can delay them getting a smartphone until 14 or 16, that's good. If we can prevent them from going on social media, which has so much harm, the companies even know how much harm it's causing to our children, we'll do that. But we'll give them way more freedom out in the real world. We'll allow them to take the subway by themselves, learn how buses work, how to shop around the grocery store, These kinds of things. Because that's how children learn. They need that responsibility. Otherwise, they're sheltered all their life. They're not sheltered from the internet, and then they get older and they're very weak as a result of it. They have a hard time. They don't know how to do basic things. And so, of course, there's a balance. We don't want them to do everything on their own, but the more we allow them to figure things out on their own, the better. But not on the digital. There's a difference between a play-based childhood and a phone-based childhood. One of the authors speaks about this, that the children have been robbed from their play-based childhood, where children are meant to play. They're meant to go out with their friends and try to figure things out and all of that. But now, because of these devices, they're having a phone-based childhood, which is like a slot machine. You know, inshallah, none of us have been to a casino before, but the way slot machines work, it's the same thing that our phones are doing to our kids. They're addictive, right? And they don't really challenge our children. So I'd recommend, you know, the book articulates it much better than I can, but I really recommend this book, Anxious Generation, and there's a movement called free-range parenting. Free-range parenting, it's like a free-range chicken, you know, something like that, right? I think it would provide a lot of benefit for us as parents, inshallah.
Okay, nice. The last question.
Oh, thank you. Well, you have been mentioning the challenges that experienced by previous individuals in history. Now, I have a question. As a meteorology student, I believe that climate change is real, and I study challenges like climate change affect millions of lives. So, from the Quranic stories of Tyrants that we just learned today, how can we, in your perspective, how can we address the challenge, the modern challenges, and help vulnerable communities? Thank you.
That's a very good question as well. And unfortunately, as Muslims, we don't speak about this enough, climate change, right? Climate change, if that's what you were asking about, right? I think as an ummah, we are doing a deep disservice by not thinking about this that much. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Qur'an, we are Khalifatullah fil ard. We are caliphs of God. We are stewards of God. We are stewards of this earth. And so it breaks my heart when I see non-Muslims at the forefront of climate justice and Muslims are not there, that our khutbahs don't mention it, that we are responsible, we're doing everything that, you know, we're not trying to limit our waste, we're using a lot of single-use disposable plastic and so on and so forth. So this is a very unique challenge that didn't exist before. You know, the Quran doesn't speak about it in this sense, but it gives us the principles of what it means for justice, what justice looks like, and what climate you know, environmental stewardship and taking care of the planet and cultivating it looks like. We have this very exploitative relationship with the planet. But if we look at this idea, the planet is very resilient and in many ways is anti-fragile. These trees are anti-fragile, but we have to make sure that we are cultivating that resilience, that we don't try to get that last drop of oil, that we try to find alternatives. So it's something, you know, I'm not particularly qualified. I can talk about the problem all day. I've spend a lot of time thinking about climate change, but there as a solution. I'll mention one thing that my teacher Imam Zaid mentioned. He's like, subhanAllah, if every Muslim on the planet fasted Monday and Thursday, think about 2 billion Muslims fasted Monday and Thursday, as many as they could, that itself would make a difference. Amount of food that we grow and that goes to waste and so on and so forth. So there are little things that we have to do in our own lives, but this is a larger problem, a societal problem. And as Muslims, we just have to make it on our top list of priorities. You know, like healthcare, you know, economy. Climate change should be up there as Muslims as well. But I don't know the solution to that, especially in the Muslim community. I wish there were more khutbahs about it. You know, it's sad that Ramadan becomes the month where we have the biggest amount of trash bags, right? You look outside the masjid and there's so many trash bags. There's a way to do Ramadan that doesn't produce so much waste. We have to be careful about finishing the food on our plates, not wasting it. And there's so many other things. So it's a very good question. I'd love to speak about maybe more, but I have to think about it a little more to give a good answer of how to deal with it.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting like discussions today. But unfortunately, our time is up, and like the next sessions will be coming up. And thank you so much for all the attendings. People here that listen to our blessed speaker today. And here are some things that I want to deliver again to everybody here, that resilience comes from the Quran. Is really, really powerful. That can be like a good insight to all of us here to be like resilient, being patient. If we have like hardship in our story, in our life, and that comes from our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and other prophets, and our Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and other stories that come from the Quran, from Ibrahim, from Musa, from Yusuf alayhi salam, from Maryam, from Yunus and other prophets. And thank you so much for all the attendings here. And let us close our sessions with Surat Al-Asr. A'udzubillahi minasyaitonirrajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wal 'asr innal insana lafi khusr illa allazina amanu wa 'amilus solihati wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Dan let us close with doa kafaratul majlis. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika asyhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.